Hello. Checking to hear if the remote folks can hear and see us. Dave.
We can indeed.
Yep, you're fine.
All right, great. We'll give a couple minutes. This is the weird lunchtime slot, so we'll let people come in from their last sessions, which are just ending up now. We'll probably also. I am motivated to not take up the entire slot so I can go get food. So we'll probably just run about an hour and then go on from there. Welcome to the Working with Git working. All right, we're not doing that.
I'm going to go towards the microphone.
All right. Actually, yeah. You mind door? Yeah. Okay. Great. Let's get started. Now that we have our document author for the first bit on, I am now an author as well. And so what we're going to cover today, two things. First, we're going to talk about the greasing document, some of the changes we made recently. And we also have a lot of good input from Dave Taylor, and we'll look at some of those. Try to just keep that quick. I think a couple questions on what we want to include. Again, this is something that we have not done the formal community. Does the IAB want to adopt this on the stream? So I want to talk about what do we need to do to kick that off soon, and what do we want to see coming in the next little bit. We don't need to have the document to be perfect and finished, but it's something that we would like to share with the community. And then for the second half, John will lead us in a more wide-ranging philosophical discussion, which would be great. Okay, let me start sharing.
With a reminder that that philosophical discussion
We'll
sits
be
between us and
time-boxed,
lunch.
and then we will eat food. Yes.
We'll talk about the concept of lunch as well.
Okay,
Exactly.
so we have this document, the EDM protocol greasing document, and this is what we've been talking about for a little while now. Since last time I recently joined as author, since I was writing a bunch of text to help on that. Thank you, Lucas, for letting me join. So we're looking at that overall. We tried to add a bit more structure to it. We're essentially introducing like, hey, Greece is this thing. It came from TLS, but a lot of other protocols are using it. And it's something that we've talked about in things like use it or lose it. But there are a lot of practical issues that come up that we think are useful to give guidance on so that it can be a repeatable, successful element that people add to the protocols that they're working on. We give some examples of different protocols that have already defined Greece, and we go into some of the details about, you know, how do you allocate a large set of values? How do you represent this into IANA well? What are the parts where you use unpredictable values? How do you use them unpredictably? We talk about some of the dangers of special casing Greece values. Thank you. Oh, geez. Wow.
Okay. Increase the font size.
That is terrible. Does it really help?
That's better.
It helps a little bit. We have thanks, Martin, for bringing up some of the cases where we've seen particularly bad special casing, and so we tried to create some pseudocode that gave examples of like what's the right way to handle Greece logic in ways that aren't going to break other things. There's a section we have now on some of the deployment considerations and incentives. I think this could still have more discussion. I think it's related to some of the stuff that Dave Taylor had been talking about before in issues. We talk about how to increase protocol variability beyond just greasing. I think there are some other examples we can start pulling into here beyond the one we have on quick frames. There had been a discussion previously around some of the PQ TLS issues where you have the client hello spreading over two packets, and that broke a lot of people, the TLDR fail issue. I think that's an example where, you know, had we done that type of greasing, which is not really using grease values, but a protocol variability of spreading out your data over multiple packets, et cetera, that maybe would have caught some of these types of issues earlier. And then we have this little stub section about protocol versions that says, we will be expanding this. And one of the questions I have to this group and the authors is, do we actually have anything more we should say here or not? So that's overall the state of the current document. We have a couple of great pull requests that Dave put up onto our GitHub, and we have several open issues, but I guess, Lucas, if you could take us kind of through your opinion on what do we want to see here developing?
Yep, thanks for the summary and the overview, and a big thanks to the editorial changes. And they weren't just tweaks, they were pretty profound changes to the text that really helped the readability. We'd had some feedback on earlier drafts that the readability, the content was okay, but the readability of it was, you know, could be improved. So it's helped. And Dave's done similar recently. We've been reviewing asynchronously, and we'll probably land those pretty soon and get another draft out. But for the major changes, there's a bunch of issues, but they're mainly just when I've been in these sessions, I've just captured an issue about a brainwave or something. Doesn't necessarily mean we want to strictly do it. Lots of them are like, oh yeah, there's this like cool example of a thing that went weird because we didn't test it early enough and it caused a real problem. That's fine. but just having a document full of examples, I think, especially because they're so quick and HTTP oriented, because that's my background, is not useful. The one that I would like to do that we have an issue for is like SIP and RTP experiences, just because those are different wire images and different, the actors in those systems are slightly different, which came up recently as well, of like, let's not call these things client and servers, but the greasing isn't just for that part of the world of those protocols, but potentially for anything. The considerations are different for those different types because code space values are bigger or smaller, and there could be different impacts. And we touch on all of that in the draft. So in terms of kind of answering your question properly, I would love just to drain now queue, close some of those issues as don't need, won't do, and really like add some text for the finishing ones, maybe with some help from people, or maybe we just set up a session as editors and try and do this stuff, and then get some review and see if this is, you understand the process from when we're really happy with this document of how we would take this forward to try and get it not adopted but published or whatever.
One just small comment on the process, right? So IAB documents have a lifetime that's similar to a normal working group document. So like there's this moment where we would do like on architecture discuss like, hey, we're considering adopting this as an IAB document. And then there's a later thing that's like equivalent to last call of like, we're considering shipping this off. So at this point, we would still be about the adoption. And one of the things that I imagine that will precipitate is many people having opinions and other examples that we have certainly missed. So I think to the point of filling out all the examples, I'd be happy seeing that done after we get all the feedback too, because we'll have probably a richer set to draw from. Okay.
So maybe we can do a session where we scrub that list and maybe just assign some labels, be like hold and see, and yeah. That'll at least help me and maybe help other people who are looking at this and thinking this is a big issue and it's a design, well, not a design change, but whatever. Beyond that, it's just really lack of cycles to make document updates. So
absolutely. Dave, can I call on you since you were doing a lot of review and contribution here? Just what are your thoughts? What are the improvements we can make with your help?
Not quite sure which question that you're asking, but I am willing to help edit if the issue is author cycles. So could you be more specific on your question? I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. One, I think, earlier on we had talked about, do you want to join as author? So like, that would be great to have your help there and your energy and cycles. But I guess also beyond that, are there, in your opinion, like other major things that need to be added or tweaked in here before we take it to the broader community review for adoption? And if so, what do you think?
I think for an IAB stream document, the IAB is not required to get any input as to whether you can adopt it, right? Because it's not an IETF consensus document. It's only a consensus among the members of the IAB. So I don't think there's anything blocking the IAB making a choice to adopt right now. I mean, I think you can accept input from the people in the EDM program, but you're not required to, right? The IAB can just decide. That's one of the values of the IAB stream, is that it's not an IETF consensus document. You can publish stuff that's actually against IETF consensus. Not that you'd want to do that, but you could, right? So I don't see any reason why you couldn't adopt it now. We usually do a IETF call for comments to make sure that the IAB isn't missing things, right? And so I think that part is important. But as far as adopting the document, I don't see any blockers there.
Yep. Okay, that's great. And yes, you're totally correct. Our common practice is that we do share documents on architecture, discuss for comment, and like mainly the incentive there is like, let's not share something that is going to be like so bad that it's just like a useless case. So let's have something that we're okay sharing and getting good feedback on, so that the feedback is useful. Martin, you had a comment.
Yeah, so there's something in the document that's missing, and it's right up front. Most of these considerations apply to extensibility models where it is ignore unknown values. And that's not true for quick frames in your example, which means that I'm a little sort of, we have a little bit of a problem there. There's a disconnect. But you don't explicitly say that this particular set of recommendations only works in this one extensibility model. It's not particularly, well, at least I couldn't find it just now. And that's pretty important. There are greasing approaches that can work under other extensibility models, I believe, but they look very, very different than this. And I'm not, some things don't really lend themselves to greasing at all, depending on how they're structured. But being upfront about that is important. Quick frames, you can't just throw out random quick frames into quick. So you're going to have to do something about that and sort of say that there's a different approach necessary for dealing with extensibility in that space.
Right. And so yeah, the document does talk about that these are for things that were ignored upon a receipt in the intro. In these protocols, extension code points are reserved only for greasing and must be ignored upon receipt. But yeah, we can pull that out. But I think it is a good point that right, that quick things like where they like quick frames, like they're part of the like, oh, you can shuffle them around, but you can't just inject new ones. Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, just replacing quick frames from quick stream frames would fix a lot of that. Yeah.
Yep, that's a good point. Okay.
I kind of disagree to some extent. I think to the point Martin's making, I agree we can make this clearer. Some of the text that Dave has added in a pull request within, well, the last few weeks touch on this in a more clear way, what greasing can do and what can't do. It can grease the code points that are reserved. It can't grease extensions that are real that don't exist yet, because if it did, then it might break those. So read the text, it'll make it clearer. We can do that improvement, but to counter example you, if I have two endpoints that have the datagram extension enabled, but they don't have a need to use datagrams because they're not doing HTTP datagrams or something, they could still potentially exercise variability by sending a datagram, and it wouldn't do anything. No,
I don't think you can do that.
Why not?
Because you don't know what the other side's going to do with a datagram in that context. They may have different expectations to you.
If it's HTTP, if the application layer, it should ignore a datagram for a quarter stream ID it doesn't know.
I think we left that a little bit unclear in 9297, where like if you sent datagrams with a get, we don't say must drop. We say if it's a stream you've never heard of, you can either buffer or drop. But if it's a stream that you know that's a get, it's a gray area.
Okay, but to me, this is identifying that, you know, that if you have extensions enabled, but you don't need to use them, then this is an ossification risk with the middle boxes that maybe do lie and say they support the extension and they don't. We see this with HTTP already, that these middle boxes blow up when you send origin frames or something like that. So anyway, I don't want to labor the point.
Please, Drew.
So when we were saying whether the document is ready to take it to the community, I think one from the past, I remember during the robustness draft that the IAB wrote, and there was suddenly a lot of discussion because everybody assumed that this doesn't apply to my protocol and why are we talking about this? And we kind of wrote that applicability part clearly, that what kind of protocols we are talking about. I think that lesson we should take it to heart and maybe do this right away to avoid all the drama that can happen.
Yeah. So I don't think you're going to get drama. I think at the same level, at least. This is not people running around with knives looking for sacred cows, but I think this could use a more comprehensive approach as well. So I was going to suggest also that you look at the quick version negotiation and greasing that as another example of something that can be useful here, and talk about some of the trade-offs there, because the way that that operates is different. You actually have to engage a protocol mechanism in order to do greasing, and it has a latency cost. And so people might be reluctant to do that. But talking about the considerations for doing that, because we have talked about doing that in implementations, and I'm not aware of anyone that's currently doing that. And so, and that's worth highlighting as another example. I hate to keep relying on Quick, so maybe you could find something other than Quick for the stream example, but I don't know that there's a good one there. TCP might be a better example in that one, in the sense that TCP receivers, you can cut segments and reorder them in a TCP sender in order to make sure that recipients are able to acknowledge correctly.
Right. I mean, I do think kind of the TLDR TLS issue is kind of similar to the quick stream one in some ways, that like, oh, segmenting your frames differently. Right. Like essentially having this thing not always come in the same atomic chunk ends up exposing bugs. So I think we should at least add that there.
Yeah.
Just wanted to, I think I'm not sure that you can rely on TCP for this, but it depends on what success means. Yeah, that's all.
One of the issues we did have was around this stub versioning bit. It sounds like looking at the quick version greasing issues and considerations may be the thing that expands that section. And then as we work on that, that either belongs in its own section or maybe folds into one of the other parts.
So the other thing to recognize is that most of the extensibility mechanisms that we develop in this organization are essentially of the form, if you don't understand it, throw it away. That's one of the most useful things that we've got in our repertoire, and we use it a lot. I think you can find any number of examples of that are outside of Quick. I think having an example that uses textual-based keys, so the sort of standard JSON extensibility model that has been implicitly adopted as a standard across virtually every use of JSON, is one that I think would be worth highlighting as something like that, and then uses string keys rather than anything else. And often the keys are not registered in any place. They just rely on the fact that there's a low probability of collision in that case. So again, there's good opportunities there.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, Gory. Shout.
You do now, sir. Well, I wasn't meant to be here. I was meant to be somewhere else, and this is the better place to be. Better place. Yeah, okay. So it struck me that nearly all the things I've said were flavored by either whether the network could see this or whether the network didn't see this, because some of these things operate completely opaquely to what the network infrastructure is doing, and a few of them don't. Are we calling that out clearly somewhere? Because it touches different people. I mean, the same principles apply, but you trigger other sensitivities if you do things in the network than you do if you trigger them in the endpoints. And the third, okay, well, go on, do that question first.
Just to respond to that, yes, like I'm sure it could be done more thoroughly, but and this is actually some of the comments that we were having on in response to Dave's PRs. There are places where we're also trying to be careful of saying, like, this is impacting sometimes just the endpoints who are participating because they're the only ones who can see it, but then it also involves just normal traditional middle boxes that are looking at the packets, but it could be other protocol intermediaries of people who are participating in the protocol, and that it's really the set of participants, be that unencrypted packets, be that HTTP intermediaries or things that are kind of within that realm, or just the ends. So I think we need to be careful to continue to use those terms consistently.
Split the two. I think that's good. And the other bit was, I nearly fell off the chair when you did TCP. Kind of like, what the heck? And then I thought that actually, if you're a TCP implementer, you're probably doing something underneath to kind of try and do this. So doing this TCP in the wild, I'm not so sure. Do we do any of this stuff in the
Nagel's
wild?
algorithm.
What?
Nagel's algorithm is an example of this.
Oh, sorry, what?
Nagel, how do you pronounce it?
Nagel, yeah.
Example of what?
Of this changing your packetization, and based on the timing, the receiver has to be able to handle it if you sent the packet with 1 byte in it or if you waited the round trip.
But not intentionally so, intentionally for another reason.
Right. I mean, I guess
Yeah, okay.
you have examples of things like TCP fast open that didn't go super well because it was less extensible and
Right.
it was more ossified than we would have hoped. Exactly. So we have negative examples. of
Counterexamples, yes.
Not using it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know
and
if
there
we
are-
want to go into that. In
and
this
there are
document.
positive examples in testers, but I mean, I'm not
That's
sure
okay.
that's where we're really at.
Yeah, I feel like that's a bit out of the scope here. Okay. Other things we want to jump into here. We can also, I think there's around the time we want to switch topics, but go ahead, Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about what might, what's the word? Ban janks. I don't know. Taking this to a wider set of people, Gary's got an issue about security considerations. We do have a section that kind of references others' security. Is there anything more we need to say? Gary and I had some discussion on the issue itself. Is there anything anyone else can think about that we would want to capture here? It would be great to know, so we can just get it done and preempt some of those discussions. If there's nothing, great, and just move on. I don't know, Gary, if you remember this discussion, but I was a bit confused. We were talking about firewalls, and I'm like, well, there's lots of different kinds of firewalls depending on the protocol. You know, there's web application firewalls. In my experience, we have attackers, for some definition of attacker, who vary like everything you can think about in HTTP. They're not trying to really do HTTP. They're just trying to overwhelm an origin server with crap. So they vary everything to avoid the hooking onto an identifier signal of some kind that you might use for not intrusion detection, but these heuristics. Do you think it would help for me to try and write some text for that? I said I could, but I don't want to waste my time if you don't think it would be useful.
Maybe it's a bit like Tommy's stuff. If this stuff is visible, then there are people who might be exploiting it in this way, and there are also IDSs that might be triggering in this way. Do we need a lot of text? Probably not a lot of text. We just need to say, well, okay, there you go. If the IDSs will learn, right? But the pain will be felt.
Right. I think another example beyond just like a traditional packet firewall, like one of the pains I've been seeing recently is as we are adding for post-quantum algorithms, adding that support to TLS, separately from like the TLDR fail issues, cases where the TLS fingerprinters will happily accept the connection, but then say you can't log into the site because you're not trusted because you've been flagged as different than you were yesterday. And that is a thing where if you had greasing from the beginning, hopefully would help. But also it's like, if you try to add more greasing, you're likely to trip these things that are doing security, but
yeah, I mean, the example that springs to mind is the JA hashing, right? So and they did the anti-chrome thing and they sort the values they were sending so they're not randomized anymore or anything. But in our current security considerations, we do have a thing that a deeper analysis of like fingerprinting and this kind of thing is out of scope for this document, which we said early on to avoid some of the snowball of discussion that might cause a kind of it is relevant, I think, but maybe it would be better done by a different group of people if they think it's worth pursuing anything in that regard. I don't want to write one sentence that snowballs into 2 or 3 sections about this stuff, to be honest. If I have to, I will, but I don't want to have to.
absolutely. All right, Dave's in queue.
Just on that topic, I think this document probably should, in trying to figure out what the right level of depth is to not cover everything, but cover enough. I think an IAB document is the one that does, I mean, part of the goal of part of the job of the IAB is to do gap analysis and not to say, well, this is a job for somebody else. If we think that there's advice to say to the IETF or to deployers, the IAB can say it. And so trying to figure out what we could say, but I think that the topic is something that the document should say something about rather than just declaring it out of scope. That's my opinion.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right. So I think next steps here sounds like maybe me and Lucas and Dave can huddle sometime in the coming weeks when we find a moment and go through some of the issues and then rev and then try to get broader review. Okay. Thank you for the feedback. All right. Now we're going to change topics. John, yeah.
We're going to switch to not having lunch. All right. Well, thank you for the time. And this is something that I've been thinking about for a little while. And I figured that this is something that might be relevant to the EDM program. But the discussion is important. We'll figure out what to do with it eventually. So the discussion here is about deployability. It's something that we've all had in some form or the other. So it's not a new discussion, but I still think it's a worthy one, and it's perhaps a little bit optimistic to expect that we will get somewhere in terms of actually doing something. But I think it's worth exploring to see what we can do. So that's the goal here. So let me just start with this, and I'll just ask for everybody's attention here for a second away from your own laptops to see if you can come up with answers for these assertions. I just want to get you in the right headspace at least. The first assertion is the IETF cares about seeing our work deployed. We celebrate it. People saying yes, people say no. Yes, all around. It seems like it's yes all around. Okay. The IETF cares about running code.
We need to use the show of hands to.
No. We're not doing consensus here yet.
How does an organization care about something? Is kind of the I think.
Well, this is the reason it's philosophical.
To the majority of people, or would we like the IETF as an entity?
I have to talk about the IETF as an entity here simply because that's too much. I understand your question, but I think at this point just stay at a high enough level because that's not the key thing.
Yeah,
Dave has his hand up.
Okay, as an AD, I'm telling you, the IETF does not care, but the IAB can care. And you can represent the community however you like, because the community as a whole does not necessarily care.
I don't think that's true at all.
Well, everybody in the community cares.
Well, our tagline is rough consensus in running code, so we probably do, is my guess.
But somewhat.
I'm confused, so I'm going to jump in here. But I would say a bunch of the ops area working groups are specifically about seeing our work deployed. So, for example, we care about IPv6 getting deployed. And so we have v6 ops that gets to report on that and celebrate it, just to quote your slide here, right? And so
yeah, I've got plenty of scotch.
v6 ops or DNS ops or et cetera is about seeing our work deployed.
Warren. And
yeah, somewhat similar to some of that. I mean, there are a bunch of groups which actually track deployment and stuff. On the running code part, though, we include it in our motto and similar stuff, and we make a big point about the fact that we care about running code. But that's not necessarily true and applied across all areas and all groups. Like IDR has we must have implementations before we'll do stuff. CyberOps kind of does that too, and some groups do, some groups don't. It's a sort of nice thing that we claim that we do, motherhood and apple pie, but we don't always actually do it.
Yep.
Yeah, so as a whole, you would want the community to be happy about the success of whatever is produced by the IETF. However, I can imagine that people from ART may not necessarily care about whether work from SEC is or not. But I mean, by association, I'm going to be happy for him if he does it, but it doesn't really affect much of me. So that measure is going to be a bit difficult to have.
Again, the question here is what do you fair enough. So maybe the statement wasn't framed very, very precisely here. But I'm saying that the work that you do in a working group, do you care about running code for that work?
Participants in working groups care about seeing their work deployed and celebrated.
Right. So I'll move past this because, you know, I didn't want to rat hole on this one yet. Hang on. This was like just getting people thinking on this, which is good. It's fantastic. The last bullet says the IETF cares, and when when I say the IETF here, to be clear, people who are doing work at the IETF, yes, people, not the organization, individuals and groups care about the work that they take on, that they care about only taking on work that results in deployment.
No.
Right.
No.
So this roughly matches where I landed, which is yes, we do, true, maybe, and I can only go lol on the other one.
There are also
Right?
a bunch of things which aren't really deployable, right? Like BCPs or.
No, I agree. The document, I'm not talking about documents. I'm talking about, yes, fair enough. All of those, there are definitely exceptions to the rule, but that's not how we define what we do as an organization. So I'm going to now claim certain things here, and of course we can all disagree about this, but I believe that our aspirations should be that we should care about seeing our work deployed. We should care about running code, and we should, running code is in quotes, and I'll get into that in a second, and we should only take on work that has a viable deployment plan, mostly, to Warren's point. So with that little bit of yes.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on that one. Yes, hypothetically, because you want to be able to invest as much time as possible in things that are going to be producing something tangible.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at that, you're basically getting rid of the scientific method itself. We assume that you're going to be looking into a bunch of stuff that's going to be absolutely useless until you find something that is actually.
This is a fantastic topic for conversation. We should get into that.
And I would be concerned that if you stop creativity on that point, you might actually be missing some elements there.
I'm concerned that we do too much creativity in an engineering
Fine.
task force.
The balance is a problem. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's where we should go to, and I think that's part of like some of the heart of this conversation is exactly that.
And
yes,
that's where the line should be between the IETF and the RTF.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next slide. On running code, my point here is that running code on your laptop is not enough. That's, yeah, I can compile. I don't need me to write code. AI can write and compile code these days. So I don't even care about whether your code runs. What I want to see is really when we say running code, what do you mean by proxy roughly is rough consistent deployed code. But I don't think that it's really something that we have clear agreement on exactly what running code means. And I think that this is because there's always been the desire to see code actually get deployed. However, the gap between running code and deployed code has grown over the past decades. So I think that just being able to get something running is not good enough anymore. And rough consistent running code as a result doesn't work as a tagline anymore.
Martin?
Go on.
Martin, that was cute for me.
That is a gift for me.
So I was going to say, we deal a lot with potential, right? So a lot of the work that we do is potentially going to change the world in some positive way, but we have to make some guesses about what it is that is going to happen in the future, and we can't always guess correctly.
Yep.
And that's essentially the problem that we continuously face, and this is why the ha thing. I actually disagree with you. I think that this organization does care about whether or not the things that it does have a material effect. The thing is that we're just not very good at predicting the future. And I think we just have to accept that limitation. The question is, to what extent can we improve our ability to predict the future? And that's a more interesting question for me.
So if I might respond to that quickly, what I'm going to say is I'm not claiming that we should become good, that we have to make perfect predictions. I'm saying that we don't even actively ask the question upfront about deployment considerations. I don't think it's a practice. Individuals do it, but I don't think that it happens widely enough.
The quick pithy comment I was going to make is that rather than saying this needs to be deployed code, it may be closer to what I think is reasonable to say deployable code. Like, it's one thing to say, yeah, I've written code,
Sure.
but if I actually ran it on the wide internet, it would blow things up because it's a terrible protocol and you'll cause congestion collapse. But if it's something that we believe is viable code that can run and like would be, something that you could move towards something that would deploy and not take everything down, that's closer to being interesting.
Yeah, clarification question. You said, Joanna, like in the last 10 years, it's got harder or something like that, or the gap's got bigger. Like, I'm old, but not that old. Can you like explain more what you meant by that? Is it really got hard? I don't know. Like, is there one concrete example you could think of to help frame it in my mind?
Sure. The way I think about this is when I look at rough consensus and running code, right? We talk about that oftentimes, but it's the idea came at a time when deployment was not an explicit consideration outside of just building the code. What, you're disagreeing with the fact that in 1986 you could just put stuff into FreeBSD and that was good enough? Because that's literally how congestion control got deployed.
No. It was your statement. So, my understanding of the original meaning of running code was it runs on the internet. That's what people meant by when they said running code. So there's no real distinction between your new framing and the old one. It's just I'm sort of confused as to what you think has changed. Because the people that put that code into FreeBSD or whatever BSD it was at the time in 1986, because I'm not going to say how old. Certainly not doing any engineering at the time. Those people that did that because they knew that people ran that code and it ran on the internet and it changed the way that the internet worked.
I agree.
Right. That was the thing, and we continuously do that here. The question is to what extent do we have gaps in what it is that we're doing that causes things to happen in theory and never end up operating in practice?
So the point you're making is, I completely agree with this. I don't think there's a disagreement here. I'm saying that this gap between being able to just build and ship things has grown to the point that we actually have to have multiple parties. We truly are working in a multi-stakeholder environment where we need to get other entities to actually play in. Like just shipping things into Unix is not good enough. Right? We need to
drain the queue.
Okay, let's do that.
We got a lot of people.
Yeah.
You got yours. Okay. One.
So I think the situation's way more complicated than this. I mean, like, I can write a piece of code and it might be perfect and awesome and I can slap it on GitHub and nothing happens. If Google writes a piece of code, it might be awesome, it might not be, but they can easily deploy it to, millions of devices and it affects millions of things. There's also very different situations in different sort of groups. So like in IDR, they're basically two big vendors. And this is deployed and running code is Cisco and Juniper have implemented it. That's very different, for example, to DNS, where most people in the DNSOP working group won't actually bother implementing anything until there's an RFC. Like IDR won't publish the RFC till there's code. In DNSOP, people won't write the code till there's an RFC because like there's a lot of just craziness. So it depends on what the type of code is, where it's going to be deployed, who you are. I agree it would be nice if there was a lot more consideration given to, is this protocol actually deployable? But I don't think that's initially actually related to the code at all, right? Like some protocols don't have code, never will have code, but they're still deployable things like operational statements, BCPs. There's no code, but you can deploy them widely, like BCP 38, zero code associated. We would like that deployed everywhere. Sorry, that's the source validation.
Drew.
So another thing that we have to also take into the consideration, especially when we talked about the BGP, for instance, that sometimes running code trumps your specification, and we still at the IETF have to put our specification first. We shouldn't be like, I understand there is a value of running code, what has actually worked, but not give up our stuff in the middle. There is a tussle there because people come all the time to the IETF and say, this is already implemented, I'm not going to change it because it's already there, even though other people in our process, which is about consensus, still objecting to it. So that tussle, we have to always address it. I think when you talked about deployment, I think two things we kind of do okay, which is like backward compatibility part. I think most of the folks always take that into an idea, new protocols deployment. Like let's take an example of IPv6, where people thinking about how that journey would happen. I agree that we were a little too excited maybe at that time and just went ahead with things. So yeah, those were the 2 points.
DKG.
Hi. I tend to agree with Martin's point that the running code means the same thing still that you're trying to say here, and maybe there's just a new definition of running code that's come up. But I'm also a little bit worried, Jenna, that your presentation is sort of trying to push the IETF in the direction of the hyperscalers. That is, we would want to selectively prefer work that is being done by the hyperscalers, who I think honestly already have outsized influence in the IETF. No offense to people who are there from the hyperscalers, but I actually think it's really important that the IETF is a space where work can be done by non-hyperscalers. And when I say hyperscalers, I mean the folks like Google who can afford to just write something up and deploy it in the sort of scale that I think you're talking about now that the internet is bigger than it was back in 1986. But I think it's really important that the IETF is a space where we can do the work of getting things that maybe are only pushed initially into a FreeBSD or Arch Linux and get deployed in that way. I think it would be a mistake for the IETF to say we're going to explicitly prioritize the things that Microsoft and Google and Apple and Cloudflare and Fastly are willing to do. Pick a couple other big ones if you want, because I really think it's critical that we get perspectives of the margins of the internet into this space, not just the folks who happen to control, the big powers.
I want to quickly respond to this. DKG, I completely agree with this point, and I don't mean to suggest that we should prioritize that work. And I didn't say what scale of deployment either, right? So I understand this gap, but to some extent, there's also the gap between reality and what we'd like reality to be. And I understand the tension here. I don't want to change that, but I do think that having a plan for deployment is still valuable, no matter what that plan happens to be.
Okay, there might be more slides here that I'm missing in terms of what you're aiming for. Like what is a plan for deployment? Maybe that's something that we need to get into in more detail.
Yeah, there's a lot to get into here, which we can't get into right now because, there's not, but there is a lot to get into and I think we should get into it.
Dave.
So I figured we would run out of time, and so I'd get in the queue now because my comment is on your next slide about I'm going to answer your question about can we bring a deployment plan into requirements for accepting new work. And so first, since this is an IAB program, first wanted to mention what the pre-existing state of IAB documents in this area is, which probably some of the people in the room already know. I pasted into chat the quotes from 5218. Sorry for the typo in there. That should be 5218, not 5128. Where the IAB already made recommendations to consider things like other implementers who are ready to implement the technology in ways that are likely to be deployed. Notice the IAB wording there doesn't say hyperscalers. It's just, who is it that actually needs to deploy it, right? So for example, is it the host OSs, is it router vendors, whatever it is, right? So generic wording there. So 5218 is relevant. In the plenary slides from 2007, we have the partial answer to your question here, which I'm then going to give you the rest of my answer. How and when might we apply learnings? This is slide 29 from the IETF 70 technical plenary. Focus on initial success factors in early stages. Number one, working group charter time. And so think about it's common practice now in BOFs to ask the question, are there people that are going to implement that, right? That's actually good that we do that, right? Protocol selection time if the working group selects among proposals. That I think is less commonly done today, and protocol creation time by people designing protocols, right? So those are three things that the IEP recommended back then. I think we do a good job at the first one and not so good a job at the other two in the IEP's recommendations back then. 8170 is the IEP RFC that says what makes for a good transition plan, right? That's not the title of it, but the abstract says that. It's planning for protocol adoption and subsequent transitions. It's the IEP RFC from 2017, right? And so can we bring a deployment plan into requirements for accepting new work? My opinion, I think that would be great. Right now, the IAB document says what makes for a transition plan, but it is perhaps much less common for a, say, charter to say one of our work items is a transition plan. And I think that would be something that would be really good for the IETF to do. And can we? I think the answer is yes, and I think we should. And that's it for me. So Thanks.
Thank you for that feedback. Oh, yeah. Just jumping in there, like one of the useful things that we can get kind of as feedback here is like the IAB is part of the charter reviews and can help the ISG when stuff is being formed. And we've been trying to compile a good list of like what are the good things to bring up. And I think, Dave, as you're pointing out, there's a lot that's already been said on this topic. And perhaps a lot of this is like, how do we just remind ourselves and the community of, yeah, these are good ideas. We should come back to this. All right, John first.
Yeah, I'm still concerned about the word deployment and how that would look like and exactly what we are. Because one of the main differences between the IETF and other SDOs is that you issue RFCs and something becomes a standard out of adoption. I'm not saying it's always the case, but that's more or less the philosophy. We don't get to tell the market what to do. We offer a panoply of options, and whatever gets adopted, well, that was the best one. So it's kind of an evolutionary environment there. And if we start thinking in advance, what would be the deployment process or plan for that, you are pretty much killing that orientation at a practical level. And I would be concerned about, again, if you're going to be presenting a plan for deployment and a working group spends 5 years getting out with an RFC, then all of a sudden those who supported that deployment will feel somehow enticed to have to do the deployment, because otherwise, why did they support the research to begin with, the work to begin with? You know what I mean? And so at that point, you become a bit of a top-bottom situation that was always my understanding the IETF wanted to avoid. I do like the comment of a transition plan, maybe, because maybe you have identified a problem, and this is how we hope that it will be doing it, and the way we may support implementers onto adopting the work that we do is by proposing how that transition could be. And then again, it's up to them whether they decide to do it or not. And on the other hand, one thing that I always appreciated when we formed, when we analyzed whether to do research groups or not, or working groups doing the BOFs, is the question is always, what's the problem you're trying to solve? So if the problem is identified, you already have a mechanism or a way for the applicability of the work that is being done. Whether it's going to be deployed later or not, you can't really have much control on that. So I think that's the current way that we are looking into things does solve the problem, but I understand as well the frustration of, I spent so many years and it never went anywhere. Well, maybe we should look into a little bit on that. But the general mechanism, I would be concerned if we touch it too much.
Since we decided to delve into history, in the distant past, when I started all this stuff, there wasn't that much difference between running code and deployment. I could go and put stuff into a Cisco router even by recompiling it and putting it in there because I knew what to do. I haven't the chance of deploying a lot of the stuff that I work on here. So that has changed, and I don't quite know how we address it. Deployability, deployment plans seem good. Actual deployment is something beyond my reach by a long way. Running code, yeah, running code was obvious. You just coded it and you made it work and you talked to somebody. So some sort of interop with somebody else running your code would have been very obvious in the olden days. It's not always obvious now. There are people putting stuff up in working groups just to come from. We say, well, I've got one working implementation and it works to me. You're like, if it's not possible to code a second one and interop, then I don't think we have running code. So I think to me, running code means at least two people have tried to do it and talk to one another outside of stack or deployability or anything. A deployment plan is something different, but also useful.
This is the difference. There's a gap. There's a difference between the way people think about running code and deployability.
Yeah, to add to this, I've been thinking about it for the last, put my name in the queue and then got more thoughts. Anyway, running code meant a different think back then. because RFC meant something different back then. Like RFC was, here, I have an idea. And so right now what you would send is in an email. And I think, you would run your code on your thing, you would have it. Whereas today, running code, especially in the context of this conversation, is a process gate before you get your RFC published, which is a completely different thing. And that's why now it's starting to sound like deployment, because like you're saying, well, the code runs on my machine. Does that count? It is running code. And so I think where the distinction starts to matter is what do we do with this? Because I think, we don't want to put up a process gate that blocks everything, but how do we tell the difference between this is a cool experimental idea that could be the next big thing and IPv10? And so I was thinking about that, and I think the answer is, who are the stakeholders and do they care? If your thing is a small, let's say, a new anti-censorship VPN, and you have two folks in this space, they're like, hey, I built an app, you built a server, look, we're building together, that's enough deployment, ship it. But if it requires changing every single router on the internet, 2 people is probably not enough. So I think it really, like, who cares should come into this conversation somehow.
So many things. Somebody mentioned IPv6. I think that actually is a really good example of things where if we'd had more discussion about, is this actually deployable, the protocol might have looked somewhat different. Right? There's a lot of features in there that were shoveled in because, while we've got the hood open, let's fix this too. Another thing is we used to do actual interoperability testing between people. Like at IETF meetings, there would be a lot of people who would kind of get the hackathon type thing, but with more testing. There was also the whole interop meetings where like basically everybody gets together, plugs your router in, and like, I send this packet, it falls over, we should probably fix that. Another thing is I think we've got a lot of people who come along and make assertions that this particular group needs this problem solved, but we don't actually often talk to the people who are supposed to be implementing it or figure out, like, if we design this thing, will it really solve your problem? Will this actually fit in your network? I've seen a substantial number of protocols being designed and like RFC shipped that are supposed to solve problems in network operators' networks. And the operators are like, I don't have this problem. And even if I did, this wouldn't fit in my network. Like, it's just fundamentally doesn't work. Couple of other quick things. In all RFCs, we have a security consideration. There's been talk of maybe we should have a deployability consideration. And yes, just like security considerations, often will be like, there are no deployability considerations. It'll be great, yo. They're having that would at least cause people to think about it. That's the main advantage of security considerations, is people have to think about it. There's a little bit of this touched on in operations considerations, where we tried to sort of backdoor some of the stuff in, like, have you considered backwards compatibility and how's that going to work? But it's still really not very fleshed out. And then the final thing, and this is something might be my soapbox or pet peeve, we've got this idea of an implementation section, and we put those in drafts and we list like all of the people who've implemented it. And then when we publish the RFC, we delete that. It's actually like in the whole description of implementation sections. They're like, put an implementation section, include this. This is only for advice, RFC editor, please remove it. I think it would be useful to change that to be, as of the publication of this RFC, here is a list of people who we know have implemented it. That provides some sort of incentive for people to actually go off and implement it, and your name and lights. It's also 10 years from now when somebody reads the RFC and is like, has anybody ever done this? Like, I want to do this, but people can look and be like, oh, Cisco implemented this in 2012. Let me see if it still exists. At least it's a pointer. And soapbox rant over.
DKG?
So I just wanted to, I've banged this drum before, I think, but I wanted to point out that if we really want to talk about deployment plans, and I think that does include things like interoperability testing, I think we need to grapple with the API surface of the protocols that we design. And a lot of times that API surface is weird and idiosyncratic because we're evolving something that's legacy, and there's existing toolkits that have bizarre API surfaces. But I actually think it's very hard to think about how are you going to make the deployment change, how are you going to evolve a given protocol without thinking about the existing API services and how you're expecting them to transform. So this is just a little pitch that if we were talking about deployment considerations, that I think we should be thinking about what the API surface looks like. I know there are people who are pretty confident that they think the IETF shouldn't do protocol, shouldn't do API design. I think they're wrong. And I think that will make us really grapple with how to actually do these kinds of deployments.
Joe.
Hello. This is all very interesting. I think people are talking about multiple things here. And we're not just talking about deployment. We're talking about implementation. We're talking about relevance and scale. And in fact, the thing we've talked least about, I think, is deployment. So I think some of the observations, like, in the old days, 10 people could implement a thing, and that would be 1/10 of the internet. And so you could actually deploy things. Well, those 10 people can deploy things today, and it's still deployed. So the difference there is perhaps relevance. If you think that in order to be worth deploying, or for the deployment to mean anything, it needs to change the way that Chrome works, or it needs to change WebKit, or it needs to change the whole of BGP for all routers, then yeah, that's relevance and scale. It's not to do with deployment necessarily. I mean, they're members of this, both sitting on the same bus perhaps, but they're not the same thing. And I think the thing that is more interesting, I'm mainly a DNS person. So one of the shapes of deployment in the DNS looks like, how do you deal with an enormously long tail where you cannot ever know all the clients and the depending systems on the changes you're going to make? And if you imagine a transition, it's going to be very much like what V6 has looked like, where you end up in a dual stack world forever, or for at least for as long as our children are alive or something. And DNS is like that, because we always have devices that are old, that will never be patched, that will never implement things, and we still have to support them. And that's the shape of deployability in the DNS. And I think those are the things that are interesting. And we definitely see proposals in the DNS working groups where people say, I've been annoyed by this thing for 30 years. I want to change it completely and throw it away.
Hello, Mark.
But those are the kinds of things that I think deployability should speak to, because that's not practical, because we actually have a responsibility to an enormous, uncountable deployed base. And those kinds of things I think are more interesting. So I think those things definitely deserve more conversation. But the idea that deployment or running code means it has to be deployed at internet scale, that's where we slip into this idea where only hyperscalers can make a difference. And I don't think that's true. I think 2 people implementing something in a kernel with a crossover cable across a desk, that is some running code that you could potentially find headaches in there. That does solve a certain set of problems, but I don't think that's deployability. And I think deployability is something quite different from that.
Shauna,
I'm next in queue.
And then I will suggest after this, we can have hallway discussion, but we will.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So that folks can get food who haven't gone.
So I think I should be clear about one thing here. I'm not I thought I disagreed with Joe, but then at the end, what he said, I agree with. So I'm not sure where I landed with that. But I will say that the goal here is to actually bring up the idea of deployability. And deployability is actually extremely context sensitive. Like, I think to Warren's point, every working group has to figure out what that means. Every piece of work, we'll have to figure out what that means. But making the process, making that deliberation of, hey, what is the deployability story for this? Not just, and this going back to something that Dave said, which I do appreciate, Dave, by the way, 5218 is definitely something, it's something I've read, and this is more like work that builds on top of it. But the idea of having people raise their hands to say, hey, are you interested in this? Are you willing to implement this? Is not good enough, in my opinion. We need to go beyond that. What that looks like, I don't know yet, but that's kind of the point of this discussion, is to kick off thinking about what can we do to make sure that we are actually thinking not just about can we build this thing, but actually, is this deployable in practice? But does it actually meet the requirements that we want to actually see the world change, the internet change? Can we set the goals of what we believe that internet change should look like? Those kinds of things are, I think, important and maybe worth actually documenting and doing something on a more systematic basis.
So if I was to briefly summarize that, I think the question that I heard you ask a working group or some new people working on a new thing is, what does deployability mean to you? It's not, is this deployable, or who wants to deploy it? Those are secondary questions. You have to ask the first question first.
Yeah, so just as Joe and DKG were talking, it reminded me of some examples. I said earlier, I'm not old, but I'm old enough to remember cases where things like HB priorities or server push failed. And some of those are around the lack of not API for people who come to the IETF, but how do we enable the users of the protocols to do stuff or build products that can realize the potential benefit of the protocol. I think, Johnny, you and I have talked years ago about some stuff you did at like Google and trying to convince stakeholders that you could do this thing. And it's like, how do I translate that into a product feature that I can convince somebody internally is worth building? Not just that you can do the thing, but should you? And then we've gone through the process of effectively deprecating server push, for example, and coming to the IETF and talking about the plans. And is there something you could ask in the protocol development process to say, this thing can work, and we've got running code that shows it works at the wire level, but how are we actually going to put this in the hands of people? Because if it's not practical to use, it might as well not be deployable.
And just, you know, connecting what you're saying right here with Joe, what you're saying, like, I think the key thing there is that if you ask the question for the people working on HTTP server push and priorities, all this other stuff, of what does deployability mean to you, then yes, like that turns into, yep, it failed. Like it did not achieve that. But like what it did for another audience or another goal may have been perfectly fine. And so the reason it gets deprecated and gets taken out of the protocol is because the community, the working group, the people working on the protocol had a very different goal for deployability than what was achieved. And so it's almost like set your bar and then understand, can you meet that bar? But that bar is going to be different contextually.
I know that we're out of time, but I'll just add one thing about this thing. This is exactly, if anybody is familiar with SCTP, I know Gauri is, and Dave might be as well. When you ask the room, was SCTP successful or not, people fall into exactly two camps. Completely failed, very successful. It depends on who you're asking. If you're asking the SS7 people, they believe it was completely successful. In fact, it was used for years and then deprecated and other things, they moved on to it. If you talk to the IP internet people, they'll be like, no, SCTP never made it out there in the wild. And so the question is very much of what did you think the original goal was for SCTP? And the original goal was actually SS7. But people still believe it was a failure, and it's exactly this particular problem. And I think that we miss that question. It might be worth actually writing that even in the working group somewhere down, saying that this is what our goal is for success for this thing, so that we can reflect back on it also more accurately.
All right. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for bringing this up. I think it's always useful to have some spicy takes to get people to talk. And I really appreciate everyone's participation here. And for the remote folks, thank you for calling in. We'll see you again. We don't have concrete plans for when we'll meet again, but we'll probably try something next IETF when we're in Montreal, and we'll try to do some work on greasing in between. Thank you, guys.
DKG, are you still there?
And then afterwards, you then find out what the questions are. You can't play the game. And so if you get lost about 3 sentences in,